Thank you, Carlos, and thank you, Maria, and to the EuMIGS lecture series for including me. So the title is Unpacking Narratives and Policies of Belonging. I'm going to lean a little bit artistic aspect of representation of migration, but I would like to start from, so I'm just going to quickly go over what I will be presenting. I would like to start from just kind of questioning. I know this is obviously like preaching to the converted of people who already are very engaged and knowledgeable of migration processes and research. But I find it always useful to take a minute to think about the broad topics that we're working on, how we define them, and with migration as the broader kind of umbrella, then look at the universes and definitions of representations, in particular to the political, but also the visual representations and knowledge production that exist around migration. And I think that kind of like build also on the presentation that we just heard about on artistic practices. But what I will be looking a little bit more here is to museums and archives of migration. This is somewhat of an ongoing work. And so I'm also looking forward to then opening it up and having questions and discussing about it. So when I was asked to suggest a few readings for this series, one that came to mind is something that has been published very recently. It's a chapter by Professor Anna Trandafilidou, and it's titled The Research Memoir of an Intra-EU Migrant Who Has Become a Guest in a Settler Colonial State. And I think that apart from being an interesting and an easy read, it's kind of like a personal account of a migration scholar on her personal trajectory through different countries and through different migration status. But I really liked the opening, in which basically she says that in her lectures, in her classes, she usually starts out by kind of delineating migration as connoted by three main characteristics. On the one hand, making it clear that migration is not a crisis, but it's an inherent feature of human life. Secondly, also making it explicit that migration does not happen in a vacuum. It's the product of the nation state, which is a form of political organization that has become dominant globally in the last 250 years, but is not perennial. It's clearly like historically contingent, and so is our understanding of borders. And I'm sure that some of you will probably have seen these kind of like condensed videos of maps of Europe that change in a few minutes, that you can see how borders were redrawn over the past 100 years. And thirdly, and potentially most importantly, is how studying migration is intrinsically political. And so starting from these premises and from this kind of like broad, what is migration and who gets to travel, I'm not sure if any of you has come across this index of comparing how powerful different passports are. It's basically an index, a database in which you can go on it and try to compare which your passport or any passport with others. It's usually quite up to date. So for instance, here, what you can see is on the one hand, you have Italy, Kosovo, the United States, Afghanistan, and Ukraine. And the number that you can see, the ways in which these passports powerful comparison works is by looking at how many countries this passport gives you access to without requiring a visa. So that would be kind of the green. Then the blue would be access to the countries with visa upon arrival. And then like the red ones are where the visa is required. So as you can see, you have, for example, a country like Italy that has access to 178 countries without having to request a visa. Ukraine is 150. Afghanistan is only 41. So even though the categories of migrant and asylum seeker and refugees, we can kind of abstractly have these broad categories in law and in policies that apply in general to individuals, we can see that then for people, for example, fleeing a conflict situation or applying for asylum, depending on which country or with which passport they are traveling, the opportunities to actually travel legally to one place are incredibly different. Um, so now moving to kind of how the representation of migration beyond the possibility to travel legally works in different realms. I think that probably the most well-known, what people think of in social sciences when thinking of representation is the more strictly kind of political representation or legal representation. So there's a large literature that exists on debates around substantive representation versus descriptive representation in parliaments, on quotas and gender quotas, debates on what constitutes legitimate political representation in democratic regimes, but also, and something that I'm going to speak about here now, there's artistic representation that can be defined, has been defined by Mitchell as, is it through representation that people organize the world and reality through the act of naming its elements. So basically, it's the idea of using signs to express something else. Use the creation of symbols that stand for or take the place of a concept, object, or relation. Now, this idea of focusing on artistic representation in migration is part of kind of ongoing conversations with colleagues who have been working on visual methodology in migration studies. There is this book that came out a couple years ago, and it's available in open access for anybody who might be interested. But the underlying idea basically is that images are being recognized as powerful tools in influencing perceptions and attitudes on migration and minorities. However, their employment as kind of scientific tools in data gathering and analysis and knowledge production around migration remains still a bit unclear, controversial. Yeah. So this book is divided in 4 sections, 4 parts, in which one is dedicated to representation in migration. And within this, and how we can think of visual representation, I wanted to look at kind of what happens, what do political and artistic representation have in common, and what happens to representation when an artistic expression aims at capturing, reflecting, or expressing an identity or story that is political, such as migration, for instance. So this image from Mitchell, who I cited earlier, basically has this sort of kite shape in which on the one hand we have the maker, the creator, the artist, let's say, and on the opposite side, you have the beholder, which would be the viewer or the public. And in the middle, there is a representation and this dab of paint and the stone. So basically here, it's not the most elegant representation, but the marked by red, we can see that representation is something that the maker needs to go through in order to reach the beholder, so the viewer or the public. But it is also a potential obstacle. So in using paint, for example, to paint and represent a stone, there's always the possibility of misunderstanding, of error, or of falsehood. And and if we're looking at the points of context or in common between kind of political and artistic representation, something that Mitchell points at is with this idea of structure. So basically the idea that representation is always of something or someone. So what kind of stories are told? The kind of research that we decide to work on is not neutral in the sense it's political. It's not indifferent. Then on the representation is always done by someone. So who does the storytelling? What is our positionality in this? And also it is done the representation to someone or for someone. So it's always done having in mind also who the viewer, who the reader, who the receiver will be. Now, beyond academia, another site, other institutions that are regarded typically as being repository of objective or scientific knowledge, typically are museums and archives. They are privileged sites for providing narratives of the past and for brokering knowledge on specific scientific and artistic fields in the present. And the museum in particular, as an institution, has been defined as an institution that holds the cultural wealth of the nation and trust for all generations, and by its function and unique position, it has become the cultural conscience of the nation. Now, as nations, museums as well are relatively recent institutions. And they are institutions that, particularly with regard to migration museums, are constantly evolving. There are new ones popping up, and the old ones are being revisited. What I'm interested is in looking at what this means for museums that deal explicitly, not just have kind of like an extra gallery or a temporary exposition on migration, but that are built as being migration museums to begin with. And so this is just kind of like a meme that went viral a few years ago, in which somebody was questioning me going up to items in the British Museum, but where are you really from? Which is sentence that has become loaded. By tracing migration museums, when they start to emerge, who finances and sponsors them, and where they are built, we can see that the first museums that brand themselves as being explicitly as migration museums are not even like 50 years old. So some of the first ones are, there's the Ellis Island National Immigration Museum that was firstly created in 1972 as the American Museum of Immigration in New York. And then in 1990 was replaced by the Ellis Island National Immigration Museum. There's the Immigrant Museum, Archive and Library in Buenos Aires in Argentina that was set up in 1985. The Migration Museum in Adelaide, Australia, of more or less the same time. The Immigration Museum, Museu da Imigração, that was created in São Paulo in Brazil in 1993. And the Immigration Museum in Melbourne, Australia in 1998. You can see that all of these museums have something in common, which is that they are all outside of Europe. So the first migration museums that were national in nature, or to some extent sponsored by states, were in former colonies of Europe. And what we can see is that in general, the goal of all of these museums is to celebrate diversity and to acknowledge the contributions that are made by immigrants to the cultural conscience of the nation, with the ultimate aim to help shape an inclusive national identity. So, for example, in the Melbourne Immigration Museum, it starts out by saying that Victorians come from more than 200 countries, speak 260 languages and dialects, and follow 135 religious faiths. In the Immigration Museum of Buenos Aires, the opening room states that the National Directory of Migration of the Argentine Republic offers you the material collected by the Immigrants Hotel Museum and invites you to explore it as an active participant. Discover and admire how your ancestors arrived and what their first steps in the country were. So keeping this idea in mind that performances, artistic representations are always done with somebody in mind of who the recipient is as well. Clearly, a sentence such as discover and admire how your ancestors arrived is very explicitly targeted to a kind of public. This is not to say that there haven't been any migration museums in Europe. There have been a number that started in the early 2000s. There's the Museo dell'Emigrante of San Marino that was set up in 97. There's the German Immigration Center of 2005. The National Museum of Italian Immigration that was created in Rome in 2009. The Immigration Museum in Poland in 2014. Now, these are all museums that were set up to celebrate the migrant who left. So these are all, whether explicitly or implicitly, immigration's museum. There have been also a number of immigration museums also set up in Europe. There has been one in Denmark that was set up in 1997. There's the Immigration History of Museum of Catalonia, created in 2004. The National Museum of Immigration History, the Musée National de l'Histoire de l'Immigration, that was set up in 2007, and the Migration Museum in London in 2017. Now, these are not the only ones, as it's a field that is quite moving fast. But what we can see in these migration museums in Europe, without wanting to flatten because they're quite different in their setup, but generally there is a language of kind of benevolent othering. So often they address integration measures for immigrants, and compared to what we have seen in terms of like celebrating the achievements of immigrants in the Ellis Island Museum, for example, or in the Buenos Aires one, it's a little bit more stereotypical. So here in the Danish Immigration Museum, we can see that there's images tied to Swedish workers, to Palestinian refugees, to Somalis, with a woman who's wearing a headscarf, Russian Jews, also with what you would expect as kind of like a stereotypical image. Now, something that is not exactly a museum, but close enough in the sense that it has been collecting stories on migrants, which have been labeled as expats in this case, is the Expatriate Archive Center, which is an archive that was created in 1990 by a group of wives of employees of the Royal Dutch Shell, so the oil and gas company, with the mission to collect and preserve the life stories of expatriates. And I found this kind of a fascinating case that was being presented at a migration conference, and ended up interviewing the director and curator of the center. And I was taking a bit issue with the way of how the archives was defined. So the choice of the word of expatriate as opposed to migrant in particular. And so on this idea of whose stories one tells and how does one frame them and name them, asking to the director of this archive how they came to choose expat as a word and how they defined it, the answer that I got was the following. Expat is a very negative and loaded word, so we start from the fact that we use our own interpretation of it. For us, expatriate is someone who lives outside his or her home country temporarily. What we were interested in looking at when we set up the EAC was to understand the mindset of a person when the move is not permanent. If I move, but I'm not going to make home out of the new place because I know I won't stay there forever. So to be an expat is really when you know that within some years you will be moving somewhere else. And how many years, it doesn't really matter. So for us, for example, we consider up to 4 years. So the international student going to study abroad for a year is to us an expatriate. So I think that it's something that is worthy of reflection in how, on the one hand, there is research on different types of migration that, to some extent, influence the ways that then they are treated and represented in museums and archives, and also the other way around. So this archive in particular is targeting knowledge producers, universities, and people working on migration. And as I was checking it yesterday, I realized that this would be something maybe relevant for master students who work in migration studies right now, because they have a EAC thesis award for master students who are working on these topics, and that is open until I think the end of the next semester in 2024. And in terms of trying to frame these within a broader um, theory of universes of representation and how this links to different kinds of social justice, I found useful Nancy Fraser's theorization, in which she distinguishes between different kinds of social justice. So one would be recognition, the cultural dimension, on who gets to be a national or who gets labeled as migrant, how we categorize diaspora, what is considered to be a linguistic or ethnic minority, both in legal terms and in representations in the media, which is separate from issues of redistribution. So the socioeconomic dimension related to the groups and the collectives that can fit the categories that I just outlined, but also how funding is allocated. So, for example, in recent years, since 2017, in Brussels, there has been a House of European History that has been set up, or this Musée National de l'Histoire de l'Immigration that has been in Paris since 2007, has been funded, and the French state invested quite the budget in it. And it did so instead of funding, for example, other proposals. Some of the other proposals in particular had to do with a museum on the history of colonialism, of French colonialism. So it's also kind of what gets represented and how it gets represented. But this also comes also with the silences or the choices that are made in what not to represent and to display. And finally, this is also tied to a dimension of representation, of political and civil representation. For instance, what kind of visa regimes apply, or who can vote in local, regional, and national elections. Who can also go and visit certain museums on migration, considering the vast disparity in mobility rights that we've seen. And so some of the questions that I wanted to bring back, on the one hand, connected to the migration museums, are what kind of stories are told in them. And I think that in order to understand them, it's important to look to who is in charge, who is on the boards, who are the curators that make the decisions about what to include, and also to who they're built for. So who is the expected audience? It's very different if it's made for schools potentially or not. And tied to migration research more broadly and our work, I think it's also important to ask ourselves, how do we define ourselves? So kind of our own positionality, reflect on whose stories we decide to tell, and also on who we are telling them for. And so this is a picture that was taken in the metro station in Lisbon that reads, "Art is not an opinion, it is a form of knowledge." And I think I put here, these are two more questions and provocations that I guess maybe they will be discussed in the next seminar. So we don't need to open them up now. But yes, I think I'm just gonna leave it here and open it up for discussion. Thank you.